Number 5. Albeit there be an act of assembly, 1645, quote, ordering all the observers of superstitious days, particularly Yule, etc., to be proceeded against by kirk censure, the guilty to make public repentance of the same before the congregation where the offence is committed, presbyteries and synods, to take particular notice how ministers censure delinquents of this kind within the several parishes, etc., unquote. Yet this seems to be gone into desuetude, seeing not only masters of schools and colleges are accessory to this superstitious profanity by granting liberty or vacancy to their scholars at such times, for which, by virtue of this act, they ought to be summoned before the assembly and censured according to their trespass, but even the elders of this church in many places are guilty of observing Yule, and such as are ordinarily communicants, with numbers of others in close communion with this church, and yet never one of these censured, but connived at. And what if I should say, too many ministers homologate this sinful custom, whereby, through ministers' unfaithfulness, a young, uprising generation are left in ignorance about the sinfulness of that and other superstitious days, etc., too much in fashion in our declining days. Number 6. Ministers in this church are chargeable with not applying their doctrine to the sins of the time, which has now almost become an epidemic sin. Chargeable with taking the patrociny of public offenders, erroneous and scandalous persons, of which many instances might be given. Yea, 'tis now become a common practice. Chargeable with levity in speech, apparel, and deportment, which is now gloried in as a prime virtue by many of them, some of whom families are the ringleaders in prodigality and vanity. Yea, and ministers chargeable with occupations and offices unbecoming that sacred function, are not censured according to the Standing Acts of Assembly, 1648, Session 26, Assembly 1638, Session 23, Article 6 and 9, corruptions in the office, Articles 1 and 2, corruption in their lives. Number 7. I may offer another proof of this church's partiality and supine negligence in discipline, that is, her neglecting to be at due pains and expenses to have youth, especially the nobility and gentry, instructed in the true Reformed Protestant religion and Presbyterian principles according to the laudable example of our Reforming Church. See Acts of Assembly 1642, Session 7, Assembly 1646, same session, Assembly 1648, Session 38, which seems to be one of the chief causes why so many of that sort fall into the idolatrous Church of Rome and of England, dreadfully prevailing in most corners of this land, as also her neglecting to make enquiry about and search out, especially since the Union, necromancers, charmers, witches, and warlocks, etc., and they brought into condign punishment, according to the word, thou shalt not suffer a witch to live, whereby such emissaries of the devil are suffered to practice their diabolical arts, to the great pain and prejudice of many people. And this is the more shameful, that several of them were punished by death, even when prelacy prevailed in this land, being searched out by the very curates themselves, which laws against such are now repealed or abrogated, 1736. And this is no lame proof that this church has openly refiled from the ancient discipline of a covenanting church in Scotland. See Acts of Assembly 1640, Session 2, Assembly 1643, and Assembly 1649. So all these foresaid instances seem sufficiently to confirm the assertion, that is, that this church is negligent and partial in her discipline, which may be one of the reasons why dissenters refuse her communion. In regard of necessity, they must either cleave to the former and refuse the present discipline, or make choice of the present and despise the former. And their practice is an explanation of their principle in this matter. Reason 13. Presbyterian dissenters cannot join with this church because she is unsound and restricted, unfaithful and defective in her government. Sure, if such as rule well, especially in the Church of Christ, are worthy of double honor, then such as rule ill forfeit their right unto that honor, and cannot expect to be honored of Christ, who do not honor him by ruling and acting faithfully for him. 1 Samuel 2, verse 30. Christ has a kingdom within a kingdom, which is not ambulatory, and such as may be wrested and changed according to men's humors and interest, but specific and of clear divine appointment, as the hedge planted about his church, Isaiah 5. But I return to give some evidences of this reason of dissent, as, number 1, the judicatories of this Revolution Church, especially at the Revolution, Assembly 1690, and since, were still crowded with a new set of Presbyterians, who had gone all the length of requiring compliance in the late times together with the politicians of the times, and men of no fixed principles in point of church government, nor of zeal in any religious concern. A confirming evidence of this is her never, to this day, assuming and claiming the intrinsic power derived from Christ, the glorious head of his church, on whom alone she depends in her meeting, acting, and dissolving of her assemblies, and the freedom of handling ecclesiastic matters therein, but has submitted to all the encroachments made by the civil powers upon the church, by frequent calling, adjuring, and dissolving assemblies, and prelimiting them, both as to members and matters to be treated therein, as is abundantly clear in the preceding accounts. Nor hath she ecclesiastically established herself by her own authority upon the former establishment of the Church of Scotland, but still remains upon the footing of the inclinations of the people and the Erastian establishment of the civil magistrate, contrary to the laudable example of the Church, Assembly 1638, Sessions 21 and 26, concerning yearly general assemblies. Number 2. This present Church did not only at the Revolution and in all subsequent assemblies neglect to assert and ratify judicially the jus divinum of presbytery and the intrinsic power of the Church, etc., but in that Assembly 1690 refused to assert by act of assembly her power and freedom with Christ's headship over this Church, though a draft was framed for that effect and read in open assembly, and when it was moved in Parliament 1703 by some friends of the Church to ratify her rights, the special and strongest of arguments to oppose this motion by those that were her adversaries was, quote, that the Church had not yet ecclesiastically declared her own rights, and it was soon enough for them to do it, when they, that is the Church, had done it themselves, unquote. Number 3. This Church did never approve and justify by any act of assembly the faithful witnessings, wrestlings, and sufferings of the Lord's servants and people in contending for our Lord Christ's interests, in opposition to all encroachments made by his and his Church's enemies, nor make honorable mention of these valiant witnesses and their contendings as was requisite, but on the contrary, an unparallelable disregarding of them, if not a condemning their contendings as disorderly walking, and themselves as guilty of schism and division. Assembly 1690, Act 5th. And as would seem an industrious forgetting and slighting them, since the Erastian establishment commenced. To adduce instances of these things seems superfluous, seeing the above-mentioned act of the Church proves the same, together with a public history published of late, representing such wrestlings and witnessings, and testimony bearers, etc., in a very odious way, yea, in such a way that seems to render the author, that is, Mr. Woodrow, an indirect approver and vindicator of the cruel treatment such sufferers were exposed to in their earnest, zealous, and faithful contendings for the faith once delivered to the saints. Number 4. This Church did neither at nor since the Revolution, after the laudable example of our worthy and zealous reformers, revive and corroborate the registers, acts, and constitutions of former faithful General Assemblies, especially from the year 1638 to 1649 inclusive, but instead hereof account them for the most part as old almanacs, out of date, though nearer the rule than any made either before or since. And this rejection of these noble acts and registers, etc., is seconded with a persecuting and reproaching the owners of and contenders for the same, as the above instances instruct. Number 5. This Church doth appoint and authorize, without divine warrant, a delegate court, called the Commission of the General Assembly, to whom they instruct the great and weighty affairs of the Church, who, instead of ripening matters for the Assembly, according to their original appointment in times of Reformation, do often finally decide and determine contrary to the sentences of the radical judicatories, presbyteries, and synods, for whom there can be no appeal to any other court whatsoever, and though no court of Christ, yet often their work is greater than that of the Assembly itself, which had many bad effects. Instance of old, the public resolutioners, their bringing in malignants to public places of power and trust, as above, and of late in supporting patronages, by thrusting ministers upon parishes, contrary to the people's divine right of election, by overruling presbyteries and synods with reference to controverted calls, and reversing their just sentences, and concurring with the Erastian powers in all their impositions, yet all their proceedings in cumulo, for most part, approved by the ensuing assemblies. The casuistical essay, page 6, says, quote, that no office or office-bearers are to be acknowledged in the Lord's house, whom he himself hath not instituted, unquote. Number 6. After the Parliament, 1690, Act 23rd, had abolished, or rather enlarged patronages, by taking the power of presentations from patronages, and investing such heritors and elders with it, as were qualified according to law, in burghs, adding the town council thereunto. All the remainder of the parish being excluded from a legal vote, in calling their own pastor, though purchased to them by the precious blood of Christ, contrary to the holy word, Acts 1, verses 15, 23, 26, Acts 6, verses 3, 5, and 6, Acts 14, verse 23, etc., and several valuable acts of assembly, that is, Act of Assembly 1596, Session 7, Revived Assembly 1638, Session 23, Article 20, etc. Yet 'tis evident, this Erastian Act, thus denuding the people of their just right, was, by this church, speedily complied with, implanting vacant churches according to this new form, as appears from their overtures for ecclesiastic discipline, printed 1696, Chapter 3, Section 3, that is, quote, seeing by law and constant practice the benefice is tied to the office, and the disposing of the benefice to the heritors and elders, these, and these only, properly have a right to vote in the nomination of a minister, yet so as all other heads of families may show their inclinations and objections against the person as they think fit, though a plurality of heritors and elders will always be thought to be the voice of the meeting, and in law and reason so accounted, unquote. See also overtures printed 1705, and the overtures printed 1719, quote, do lodge the sole power of the nomination of ministers to vacant parishes in the hands of the majority of heritors, unquote, whereby they are allowed a fair negative over all the elders and the whole congregation. How flatly this kind of government is repugnant to the above scriptures and the acts of faith and free general assemblies and parliaments in former times, any judicious person may easily discern. That is, Assembly 1649, Session 4, in the form of Presbyterian church government agreed upon by the Assembly of Divines at Westminster, approven by the Church of Scotland 1645. It is declared, quote, that no presbytery shall ordain a minister in a parish unless the said congregation judicially give in their consent and approbation before the presbytery to such a man to be their minister, unquote. In the Act of Parliament abolishing patronages of kirks, March 9th, 1649, Act 23, declareth, quote, that presbytery shall proceed in the planting of kirks upon suit and call, or with the consent of the congregation where they are to serve, unquote. On whom the same act declareth, quote, none is to be obtruded against their will, unquote. See also the first and second books of discipline, Chapter 3. I am of opinion this is no small instance and evidence of the charge. It seems to discover very clearly that this church is both unsound and sadly restricted in her government. But number 7, if it can be objected that parishes are allowed an adhering call, I answer, it is true in some cases and places people are allowed an adhering call. But what of this adhering call? As it only takes place, or is given to people in parishes when there is a prospect of their being for or concurrence with the person nominate. For when the case is otherwise, as most ordinarily it falls out upon two just grounds, that adhering call never shows face. So, on the other hand, what does this sham call of adherence avail? It is good for naught. It has no legal foundation. It is not pleadable by law of any kind, whether civil or ecclesiastic. It adds no right unto the benefice, and by no manner of means can it be called a gospel call, as matters run now, in regard only that call can and must take place that is given by the plurality of heritors and elders, even although these heritors neither reside in these parishes nor are of the communion of this church, yea, though they be downright malignants. And by this means hirelings, time-servers, and men-pleasers are obtruded, and thrust in upon parishes, vis et modus. Hence that so-called adhering call is contrived, as it would seem, to delude people who know not such intrigues. Such kind of management is directly contrary to the Acts of Assembly 1596, Session 7, ratified and revived in 1638, Session 23, Article 20, where no pastor, reader, or schoolmaster is to be, quote, intruded in any office of the kirk, contrary to the will of the congregation to which they are appointed, unquote. See also the discipline above mentioned. Number 8. As this church, at the moderation of calls in presbyteries, ordinarily cite more acts of Erastian laws than acts of the apostles, and are far better observed, So when differences arise among heritors, etc., about such moderators, some being for this man and some for that man, etc.,